Okay guys, so this video is about conditionals. Now, I highly recommend that while you watch this video, you have the presentation open so you can take a look at it and everything becomes clear. I will try my best to have text on screen and all that fancy editing, but we'll see what happens. So let's get started. What are conditionals? Well, conditionals are a type of sentence that include two clauses. Now, if you remember, a clause is just a subject and a predicate, like I eat or it rained yesterday. That is a clause. Or the man who lives under the bridge. That is a clause. And they can vary. They can be independent. They can be dependent. But for now, we just need to focus that a conditional is a sentence that has two parts to it, basically. One of them is a cause, and the other is a consequence. For example, if you don't turn in your activities on time, the teacher won't give you a good grade. Or if you don't drink water regularly, you might be dehydrated. They are usually used to give us warnings or advice or give us some form of instructions. Now, the type of sentences that are included or the name of the clauses that are included in conditionals are two. There's always an if clause, which is a part of the sentence that contains the word if. Like in the example I gave, if you don't turn in your activities on time, that is our if clause. On the other hand, the main clause is the outcome, the possibility, the consequence. The teacher won't give you a good grade. This is a thing that belongs to all sort of conditionals. So all of them have an if clause, all of them have a main clause. The if clause is identifiable because it has the if part, and the main clause because it's the consequence to the first action. There are four types of conditionals: zero conditional, first conditional, second conditional, and third conditional. Now, there's a way to mix them that becomes mixed conditionals, but we'll talk about them later. Each one of these has a different function, and some are more common than others. Today we're going to cover all four of them, but in theory, what should be new for you is just the mixed conditionals. Now, zero conditional. A zero conditional is a direct cause and effect. It's basically a law. If you don't eat, you get hungry. Zero conditionals are mostly used for cause and effect scenarios. They tend to be considered as laws or very specific situations, like if you don't eat, you get hungry. This always happens, possibly in science, right? If you have a square, the sides are all the same, etc. That is a zero conditional. The example that we have in the presentation is if it rains, the floor gets wet. I am saying that this happens every single time, right? So it's an A equals B relationship. If A, then B. There is not, it's very axiomatic. There's really not much wiggle room there. The two verbs are in the simple present, rains, gets. And it is not very used in day-to-day speech because, like I mentioned, it's more of a law or sciencey situation. It doesn't have any modal verbs and is always in the present. That is the main definition of the zero conditional, is that there are no modals. If it rains, the floor gets wet. No models there. The first conditional, this is, I believe, one of the most commonly used ones, if not the most commonly used ones. And they refer to a possible future consequence. So, whereas in the zero conditional, two things can be happening at the same time, like it's just a direct consequence of it. In the first conditional, it projects itself towards the future. And how possible this is, or what the first part, what the effect will have on the second part, is defined by the model that you're using. So, for example, if I say will, then I am establishing a future situation that is probably 100% going to happen. If I say may, then I'm stating a possibility, as in I'm not 100% sure, but it could or it may happen. And if I say, for example, can, then it's a possibility, but it requires inaction, right? Like we had mentioned before, the model, or when you say can, it implies that you can do it, you have the capability of doing it, but you can decide whether you do it or not. So when we have the first conditional, we have, for example, if it rains, the floor will get wet. So in this current scenario, if it rains, the floor will get wet. We can use any model that we want there depending on what we want to communicate. right? If you eat healthy food, you may, I don't know, live longer. It's not a guarantee, but it may happen. Or if you finish all your homework on time, you can go out to play, probably just on your yard right now, but you get the idea. If you follow the recipe, you can have a good dish at the end. It's something that can happen, right? So this is important. The first verb is in the simple present, while the second one is a modal plus an infinitive. So if it rains is the same thing as the zero conditional. It's still in the simple present, right? And the second one is the modal, which we're going to use will, can, and may to keep it simple, plus an infinitive. On the second conditional there's one main difference between the first and the second, and when it comes to the meaning of it. And one is that the first conditional is basically a situation that is in the real world, so to speak. If it rains, this can get wet. If I work hard, I get better results. This is a reality, right? On the other hand, the second conditional is about a hypothetical or an unreal situation. For example, if I were rich, or if I lived in a different country, or if I didn't have to teach this class, things that I have to do or things that I can't change. But if the conditions were different, then the result would be different. The relationship between A or B is not very real or is very unlikely. So we can imagine the first conditional as an A-B consequence in the future. And then if we have this timeline, we have a parallel one that is where we have the second conditional happening. It's like an unreal world. It's not a real situation, right? So if we want to use a current example, it would be like if there was no coronavirus, then we could go out. And that is in a real hypothetical situation. It's unreal because there is a coronavirus outbreak and we cannot go out. Even if we want to, you shouldn't go out. Both verbs are in the simple past tense, right? That's the main aspect to it. English does not really have this hypothetical tenses like other languages do. Like in Spanish, we do have hypothetical tenses. In English, we don't. So we need to create something which comes from the past tense use. So by saying, if I had more money, I would have a better computer, for example, or I would have a good camera or whatever. I'm speaking in the past, but you understand that I'm not talking about the past. I'm talking about a hypothetical different timeline. So, if it rained, the floor would get wet. But because it doesn't rain, then the floor doesn't get wet, right? The modals are backshifted, which we saw when we talked about reported speech, right? Backshifting is you take the verb and you take it back one tense. In the aspect, or in the case of modals, this is that will becomes would, can becomes could, and may becomes might. This is very important to remember because the one thing that you're changing about the main clause, which we discussed, is the consequence, is the modal. We are not changing the other verb, what we would call the main verb. In the other example, we have the floor will get wet. Now it would get wet. Hypothetical. And that is the main difference between the first and the second conditional. Now the third conditional is where things get a little bit more complicated because, okay, let's say that in the second conditional, I could potentially in the future have more money, right? Or I could, the outbreak hopefully won't last forever, so that condition will change or may change. It's just hypothetical, but it could happen, right? There's a slim chance of it. It's kind of like if I won the lottery or if I won the Cetis sorteo, right? That I bought tickets, so there's a very slim chance that could happen. That's second conditional. But the third conditional, 100% hypothetical. It cannot happen simply because in the second conditional, we had the hypothetical in the future, right? In the third conditional, our hypothetical stuff is in the past, and we cannot change the past. So because it's in the past, then the outcomes or the situation explained in this tense are hypothetical 100%. So we are talking about an unreal past. We used to talk about regrets, things that may have happened but did not, or expectations that were not fulfilled. So when we expect something like, oh, if this had been a better movie, then maybe I would have enjoyed it more, right? Like we cannot change this movie, or we cannot change our viewing experience because that's in the past. So that everything that we say about that is hypothetical. The example that I mentioned before, if it had rained, the floor would have gotten wet. But it didn't rain, so the floor didn't get wet. The main clause refers to an impossible reality because the past occurred differently. If it had rained, the floor would have gotten wet. What is changing here grammatically is that we're using perfect tenses. Whereas in the past in the second conditional, we had past tense, here we have a past perfect tense in the if clause. In the main clause, we are using a past modal, a present perfect. And that is very important to keep in mind because we have past perfect plus present perfect. Now, mixed conditionals are two kinds of conditionals mixed. The ones that we mix are the second and the third. And we can have a second plus third, like second if clause plus third main clause, or we can have a third if clause plus a second conditional main clause. What does this mean? Well, there are two kinds of mixed conditionals, and they work by combining the second and third conditionals in different orders. It may be that there is a third conditional if clause plus a second conditional main clause, or a second conditional if clause plus a third conditional main clause. In this first example, it's a third conditional if clause plus a second conditional main clause. If we had developed a vaccine for the virus, the risk would be lower. If we had developed, we have past perfect, which indicates to me that this event happened in the past, or that I cannot change the event because it exists in the past. And then we have the risk would be lower right now, right? So the pre-existing condition was not completed. My present is hypothetical. In the other example, we have a second condition in the if clause and a third conditional in the main clause. If the president was smarter, the plan would have worked better. So the president, any president, hypothetical president here, I'm not talking about anyone in particular, but if the president was smarter, that's a condition that we have to live with every day, and we cannot really change that, right? So if the president was smarter, in my timeline, if he was smarter, hypothetical, the plan would have worked better in the past. So I'm taking a condition from the present that I can't change, and I'm moving it to the past, where the consequences already happened. If the president was smarter, it's a second conditional, right? Because I have the was, which is in the simple present. And the plan would have worked better. We know that it's a past modal plus a present perfect, which means that it's a third conditional. And that's why it's mixed. These conditionals are used again to express regret or situations we wish were different, but they're not. A zero conditional. If I don't eat, I get hungry. Present, present. First conditional. If it's sunny out tomorrow, I may go for a run. Now, if condition A is fulfilled, the day being sunny, I may go for a run. Possible consequence, right? Second conditional. If I liked that kind of movies, which I don't, I would binge watch Star Wars during the lockdown. Now, here we have a hypothetical situation because I hypothetically don't like these kind of movies. So I'm not going to watch them. But if I like them, I would do it. So that's a second conditional. In the third conditional, if I had been more careful, I wouldn't have run out of food by now. Which again, hypothetical. But if I had been more careful, past perfect, I wouldn't have run out of food by now. Present perfect. We have the two mixed. What I'm going to call mixed A is the third plus second. So mixed conditional A. If I had known about this special on Uber Eats, I wouldn't be eating Little Caesars for the third time this week. So if I had known, past perfect, I wouldn't be simple past. Okay, so mixed conditional be, which is a second conditional plus a third conditional. If my computer worked better, which it doesn't, I would have bought the entire Sims collection to play these days. Right? So if my computer worked better, which it doesn't at the present, it's not a reality, but if it did, this is what I would do. So if my computer worked better, I would have bought the entire Sims collection to play these days. So we have a second conditional, past or simple past, plus a third conditional, would have bought, which we have a past modal plus a present perfect. Comas. Now, if you have been looking at the presentation and if I was successful in putting the text on the screen, you will have noticed that, or you may have noticed by now, that in all of these examples, there is a comma in the middle. All of the examples that I have so far presented have that. And you need that comma. When using conditionals, the order of the clauses is what is going to impact if you use a comma or not. So what happens is, if you use the structure that I have been presenting, if plus main clause, you need that comma in the middle to separate the two clauses. However, if you use main clause plus if clause, then you don't need a comma. That's very important. And you should always use a comma if you use the first structure. If it rains, comma, the floor will get wet. Now, if you reverse that, you don't need the comma. The floor will get wet if it rains. When I have the if in the middle, I don't need my comma. That's all you need to remember. If my if is at the beginning, you need a comma. If it's in the middle, then you don't need a comma. If the president were smarter, comma, the plan would have worked better. On the other hand, the plan would have worked better if the president were smarter. Now, I hope that everything is clear, and I hope that everybody's ready for class. And that's it. Please go to Blackboard, check the activities for this session. It is very important to upload them today. And yes, you have until 5 p.m. today to upload them. And that's it. Have a nice day. Stay safe. If there are any questions, put them in the comments below. And if you like this video, then give it a like. Hope it was helpful and that you guys are doing just fine. See you around.